Hi, everyone. Welcome. I just want to give a few minutes for people to join us. So hang tight and we'll get started. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Just give us a few minutes. We'll get started. We'll get started around, I would say, about 2 more minutes. We'll give a few more minutes for people to join. So hi to those who are just joining right now, and we'll get started momentarily. All right. So just a few sort of housekeeping items. So Mike is going to be presenting for roughly 30 minutes. There will be opportunities to ask questions in between. So if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat or raise your hand to ask him any questions. This will also be recorded. So if any of you have to jump off for any reason, we will make this available to all of you so that you can watch it if you need to do that. So I'm going to start by thanking you for attending and being part of this ESG for Startups initiative at 500. And to introduce our speaker today, it's Mike Stopka. Mike is an associate principal at Buro Happold. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Chicago office. He has nearly 2 decades of experience in sustainability innovation and building his campuses, businesses, and cities. He guides the firm's sustainability services, and he focuses on owner-side advising with regard to strategic planning, company culture, real estate development, and operations. He has a broad experience across sectors, so from within organizations and as a consultant. And he has delivered sustainability services for design practitioners, contractors, universities, and research institutions, nonprofits, basically across the board, just about any type of organization. He founded MIST, which is a consulting firm that provides strategy, education, and advising services to implementing sustainable policies and improvements for organizations. And he was also the director of sustainability at the University of Chicago. So without further ado, there are many other things that Mike has done and in the sustainability. So you're in good hands, and he's going to be able to kind of take you through some of the beginning steps if you're interested in thinking about how to measure sustainability for your organization.
Okay. Hey, hopefully all can hear me okay. Thanks, Tracy, for the welcome. I'm happy to be here. I think that this opportunity to talk with you all is always exciting to me, particularly early stage companies, and the impact that you all can have as you go out and expand and grow, I think is exponential selfishly for me, the good sustainability impact you can have. So anything I can do to help enable or aid that is always high on my priority list. And so I'm happy to talk through with everybody. My background, as Tracy said, is pretty broad, but essentially what I focus on is helping organizations think about what their sustainability strategy should be and how you then implement it. So it's less on the how do you do stuff that sounds really good and more on the what do we need to actually do to get from point A to wherever you want to be in the future with a zero footprint or whatever your goal happens to be. And I specialize in thinking through that strategy and then knowing the right technical people to bring in to make it happen. So I'm going to walk through some slides here, as Tracy said, and there'll be breaks to ask questions and discussion. So put things in the chat if you have them. And then when I have a stopping point, we'll pause and scoop them up and address them then, or carry them to the end. Okay, so I'll just start going into it here. You know, it's imperative for companies to understand not only why, although I think this is less of a thing than it used to be. I think most companies sort of understand why sustainability is important. The how is really where we get into the meat and potatoes and the fun stuff. And what I hear a lot when I talk to VCs or early stage companies is, I'm so early, does this really matter right now? Where would I even start? And what I hope to do with this presentation is just lay out both some reasons that it is not too early, and then some steps that you can take now or whenever you feel it's appropriate to get started, because it's all about putting one foot in front of the other with this. There is no magic bullet. So the learning objectives, first, we'll spend a few minutes going through what is a definition of company-wide sustainability, because this is a nebulous word. It's hard to unpack. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. So can we be a little more specific with what we mean when we say organization-wide sustainability? So we have a shared definition. And then I touched a little bit on this already, but we'll go into the risks and opportunities of why this is important, why it matters, and then most importantly, the initial steps that you can take. So when we think about defining organization-wide sustainability, there's lots of different frames out there, all publicly available. And so here's a few of them, but one of the big terms that you'll hear thrown around, and you know that I know 500 has used and other companies use it all the time, is ESG. So environmental social governance. So what does that mean to you, to your company? And what it effectively means is if you're going to have a credible approach to making your company sustainable from the environmental and social perspective, what topics do you need to address? And it obviously includes environmental concerns. So this is things like the changing climate, global warming, not using more resources than you need, or better said, figuring out how we're not just going to deplete the earth of fossil fuels and its resources so there's nothing left for the future, right? Those are really well known, easy. I think we kind of intuitively understand a lot of those. The topics that have been emerging more and more, particularly over the past year, but really the trajectory over the number of years has been up, are more of the social concerns, the social side of the sustainability discussion. And the list could be a mile long on all of these, really, but this is just a summation. But this is things like gender equality, fair trade, human rights, all of those sorts of subjects where it really gets into how are you treating people? What is their quality of life? What is their quality of life as an employee at your company? What does that look like? How do we measure that? So that's where we get into social sustainability. And then corporate governance. This is maybe slightly, we put this in the camp of it needs to be watched closely the bigger your organization gets, but there's still some things you can think about now. So how are you managing this? Do you transparently report or let your stakeholders know what your definition of sustainability is or what you're doing about it? How are you considering things like employee compensation, management structure? So those all go in the corporate governance bucket. So together, the way you could think about these is if you have some kind of an approach, not necessarily to all of these, but try and have some balance across what you're addressing, that's really what ESG is meant to do, is meant to say that we need to think about this broad spectrum of topics, or we will not credibly address sustainability in the way that we need to. Another way to look at this is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So this is separate from ESG, but a few years ago, the number of countries, the UN got together and said, we don't really have a worldwide shared language when we talk about sustainability. And you can see just by scanning the topics on this list that it's everything from environmental to social to governance. So in a way, it addresses all of those ESG topics. But what the SDGs did was put this language in place that countries could use, companies can use, businesses can use, and there's lots of detail right behind each of these. I just picked one here to show as an example. Gender equality, you can dive deep into the detail on what each of these mean, but it provides this shared platform that you can look to in order to think about what matters to you and what you might want to address, and then have conversations with those in your supply chain or your partners or your customers around, are you addressing any of these SDGs? Are any of these important to you in particular because of what your business does in your own specific case? A definition that I will often use with my clients and who I talk with is slightly different, and it's organized more around how I think of a business running from day to day instead of these esoteric sustainability topics. So there's sort of three buckets that I like to use. There's facilities and operations. So the buildings you own or run or operate, whether that's manufacturing facilities, corporate offices, your office in your house, like any of it can fall into this category. Your suppliers, this is the physical stuff that you deal with, the buildings you own, the goods you buy, the products you make, it all falls inside of this. And then we have this strategy and leadership. Are you adequately budgeting to make sure sustainability gets addressed? Are you reporting what you do in a transparent way so that those internal and external to you know what your sustainability footprint is, or what you're doing to figure out what it is? So that's another really important bucket. And then the third is education and engagement. So are you upskilling your employees as you ask them to do different things, or as you yourself are being asked to do different things because let's say you're trying to reduce how much waste you generate. Maybe you don't know how to do that, right? So we need to learn skills, and those would fall into this bucket. And then in addition to outreach and branding and the way you're talking about yourself. So very often when I work with an organization, what we'll do is an audit. And that's maybe too punitive of a word, but we'll just do an assessment, qualitative or quantitative, across these areas, and fill out a report card and let an organization know, here's where you stand right now, here's where we see opportunity. And using this as a framework to do that gives at least the organization the peace of mind that they've got broad coverage, that we didn't just look at energy, or we didn't just look at the materials in their supply chain, but we thought about a number of things, and therefore they've got coverage when they talk about this with their investors, their stakeholders, or whomever. So this becomes a helpful framework for that. So all of these things are frames, the SDGs, this, ESG, all these acronyms, they're just really frames to help organize this big nebulous word of sustainability. And I'm just offering up a few of them so that as we go forward with this presentation, when I say things like sustainability across your organization, you're going to know at least what I mean, even if you don't fully agree with everything in the definition. So let me pause there before we transition on, and just ask if there are any questions or topics to be raised. Can take anything now, or we can chat at the end. And Tracy, you'll let me know if you could help me maybe watch the chat, so I'm not missing anything. If I'm not seeing it come up, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yep, we'll do.
Okay. Hearing nothing now, I'm gonna move us along. Okay, so what are some reasons to pay attention to this? Why does it matter? I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I think they are somewhat intuitive at this point, but we do have a worsening climate crisis, right? There's vulnerabilities that are associated with that in your company, like changing weather, changes utility bills, changes material availability, a whole series of things. It leads to governments and other regulatory entities making more stringent demands of you. So for instance, in New York City, there's a law called Local Law 97, which is requiring all buildings, existing or new, to achieve a carbon footprint below a certain amount. And if they don't, they're paying, fines in the 5 to 6 figures a year. So that kind of and those kind of regulations are rolling out across sectors in a number of areas, and that's only going to increase. So it's sort of the cost of inaction is the risk there. And I mentioned supply chain vulnerabilities a little bit already, but certainly material availability changes based on, flooding, fires, anything that you can think of related to the climate crisis. It's going to can make your supply chain more vulnerable if you're not changing how you get your materials from more resilient sources, for example. And then certainly investor expectations, changing customer perceptions. I can't tell you the number of calls I've gotten this year from large and small companies who are dealing with investors saying, we will not invest unless you, and insert sustainability performance word there. And a lot of companies are getting caught sort of on their back foot of, what do I do? How do I do this? How do I catch up? I want access to these investors, but they're starting to change what they're making me do. So that's probably the biggest risk that I am seeing at this point in time, this immediate financial risk. And then this can lead to other things. GitHub, I think most of us are probably familiar with GitHub, but open source software development platform. They face these accusations that they created a hostile workforce or workplace environment, and those were proven substantial, and it had to do with some things around gender inequality and pay gaps and other elements like that. And it forced the CEO to step down and forced some pretty serious transitions in the company years ago. So things like that are real. And the risk of inaction here, that's maybe an extreme example, but a possibility. All right, and so then the opportunities, and pretty easy to envision what these are after talking through the risks, I think, but certainly access to funding. So there's much more contingent funding that's tied to ESG and social impact funds, sustainability-focused investors, even traditional investors at this point that are doing due diligence on ESG. I will often do pre-screens for funding rounds for VCs or other groups to look at investment companies that they're thinking of investing in and see how legitimately sustainable they are or have the potential to be. And that wasn't a thing that I was really asked to do or sought after to do until I would say 2 or 3 years ago, and it's been increasing. So that is certainly real. Lower cost of capital, certainly. The more resilient your operations are, the more resilient your supply chain is, the more sustainable they are, the less investors are going to charge you because the lower the risk they have of losing, right? And so that all intuitively makes sense, but we are seeing this come to bear as it relates to, excuse me, a number of sectors right now. I think this is less of a differentiator than it used to be, but there's still room for it. But branding, certainly, and being able to tell your sustainability story and having it be real and credible used to set you apart. And now I think what I'm seeing a little bit more is if you don't have an angle to play here, you're behind, as opposed to getting ahead playing this angle, although there is a little room to do it still. Stakeholder engagement, you can, obviously your customers, employees, supply chain, they want to know, or sometimes are asked by their own supply chains, if what sustainability credentials their partners have and need to have. And this is very often something that we see coming up, that if you don't have a certain certification or you're not on a path to get one, that they're going to start to look to other vendors who do have those. And it feeds right into talent acquisition and retention. This is a hot topic. We're seeing tons of mission-driven people coming out of college, and more so than usual, that want to work for a company that stands for something that leads with a purpose, and sustainability provides a path to that. There are lots of other paths to that as well, but very often, this becomes number one or very high on a potential recruits list, especially or junior member recruits of things that they're thinking about when they're choosing where to go and where to stay. And then cost savings. So saving energy, reducing waste, saving water, reducing the number of airline miles you travel. It all has cost savings associated with it. There's capital costs sometimes, but there's money to be saved in the long run from that. So that, and then just to really drive the point home here. So 73% of people in this Nielsen survey said they would change their consumption habits based on their environmental impact. And whether they really would or not, this is an interesting metric because it just means that almost 3/4 of the general population are thinking along these lines. And companies, mostly larger companies, but about 44% of them from this McKinsey report, they are starting sustainability departments and groups only because they see a path to growth. They see a path to revenue. They're not starting it to be entrepreneurial or to be an environmentalist, right? There's a bottom line here that the numbers are bearing out. And I've been seeing this for a long time, but it's interesting to see these trends accelerating. And then diversity. So management teams that are led diversely, they report profit margins that are 9% higher, or revenues that are 9% higher. And then innovation revenue on top of that, that's about 20% higher. So there's the math is bears out, besides I think what those of us in the market and in the industry have sensed as trends coming for a long time. So I'm going to pause here. I see there's something in the chat, so give me a second. Yes, okay. So I see a question here. Do you find it necessary for a startup or any other company to check their suppliers for ESG compliance? Yes, increasingly. I see it, frankly, more in larger companies and larger supply chains where we are having big companies that will say, I need to do sustainability reporting, ESG compliance, because I have to check the box. Otherwise, I'm going to lose like my best partners. Definitely seeing that. And I think from a risk perspective of who your suppliers are, even if they're not asking you to check the box, I do think we are getting into the territory where you have to worry about the resiliency of your partners and their ability to supply you what you need and get you what you need. And can things like climate change and global warming affect that and make them brittle? That is a real concern. And then another question I see here is how deep are investors going into the details about ESG? Is it mostly policies, or are they also checking real life actions? It's both. It's both. I think it's really more right now they're checking kind of policies, and they want to know that at least you're on the path to doing the right thing. There are a few investors where this is really their niche, where they're actually doing due diligence on what does your travel numbers say, what are your waste reports, but I know very few of those. But even if you would have asked me that question even 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said the answer was very low. Probably I could count them on one hand. And then one more question I've got here is, how do you certificate your startups or ESG compliance if they are late in seed series A? Is there a company that does a quick and not expensive ESG compliance process and certifies it? It depends what you mean by certify. I mean, there's lots of ways to do compliance processes. And then when you talk about certifications, it really depends on who you want to certify to. So if you're talking about an entity like, let me think of one like CDP, which used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project. So you can get a third-party certification that says somebody checked over your entity, filled out a CDP report card for you, and has certified it as an approved CDP third-party validator. And that can stand for something more than, say, if you just hire a firm to do a check in whatever methodology they have and write you their own compliance letter. I haven't seen a lot of clamoring for the former. Most times companies just sort of need functional guidance of what to do now and where they're at right now. And the certification that they're going through that process has been satisfying most of the requests, particularly from the investor side, but there's different reasons why you might ask for a certification. Okay, thanks for the questions. It's good. It's good to get them to sort of break up the monotony of me talking at you. So I appreciate that. Now I'm going to keep going and get a little bit more into the meat of what I think matters here. And so that question of, are they checking on real life actions? These are some of those real life actions that are going to get you a better ESG score. Like that's what I want to get into now, because for me, that's what sort of matters here. So high level, there's 4 of them I put in here, lots of things, but these were really meant to be things that would be applicable to a company at any stage of its growth or development. So understanding what's in your greenhouse gas footprint and your carbon footprint, I'll walk through what that is, but I understand everyone might not be able to affect or be in a position to change what their footprint is, but at least knowing what's in it is powerful, and I'll go through why. And then having a vision and a goal statement, it sounds maybe like a silly thing, but most companies I talk to don't really have a vision or goal statement around sustainability, and things sort of tend to wallow when that's not the case. And then really owning your story. So realizing that you don't have to be perfect and you're not going to be perfect at everything, and that people want an honest story about where you're at in your journey, and leveraging that. I've got an example of that. And then lastly, just the value of knowing how much things are going to change, how much regulations change, how much your companies are changing. There is no substitute for having the appropriate advisors, formal or informal, that you are tied into on a regular basis. All right, so carbon footprint. And I apologize for anyone that is well-versed in carbon footprints. We're going to go through some of the basics here, but I think it is necessary. So CO2 emissions, it's sort of the sum of all of the activities that your business undertakes. And the more fossil fuels it uses, the bigger the carbon footprint. But we'll get into that in a second here. All right, so what's in it? A bunch of things, and we'll talk through them. So bear with the nomenclature. You'll see scope 1, 2, and 3 kind of pop up on the screen next to the bubbles. The bubbles are what matters right now. I'll talk about the scopes in a little bit. It's just some sort of accounting language for greenhouse gas inventories. But scope 1, natural gas heating. So presumably some of your facilities are burning gas to make heat, to either make things or heat your space, your office, so it's comfortable. So there's a fossil fuel greenhouse gas footprint associated with every time you burn that gas. You're also burning fuel in the vehicles that you own. There's a global warming, greenhouse gas footprint associated with that. You're purchasing electricity most likely, and somebody is burning some kind of a fossil fuel very often, although the grid is becoming cleaner, but someone's burning coal or something else to make that electricity for you. There's a footprint associated with that. Then we start to get into the really big stuff. And you can kind of take this diagram as the bigger the circle, the bigger the carbon footprint. And every company is different and it's custom, but just to give you a rough order of magnitude of how we generally see things shake out when we do a carbon inventory, it generally follows these trends. So business travel, huge. Usually you can fit the footprint associated with all of the miles driven, the flights taken, and everything else. Usually you can fit all of scopes 1 and 2 inside of that. Certainly moving your goods around. If you're making widgets, you're shipping materials, you're moving them from a manufacturing facility to a customer or to a retail environment. There's a lot of transportation that's involved with that. And then all of these other small things that end up adding up to something big. So your employees have to get to and from wherever they work. These days, those footprints are really low because a lot of us are working from home. So that you can see that bubble shrink to 0. The goods that you buy, the disposable goods, so the paper for printers or snacks for employees or anything you can think of that's disposable, there's a footprint associated with making and getting that good to you. Capital goods, so the buildings you build or renovate, the other capital materials that you buy and own, those all fall in capital goods. And then also, interestingly, if many of you are probably service-based entities, so there's a footprint associated with the delivery of services as well. Like you have to do things to make and transport or make and transmit software to people that use energy. And we have ways to kind of track and calculate the footprint of a lot of these things. So the waste that you generate, landfill waste, is part of your carbon footprint. And then end of life disposal of a product. So what happens, after you throw your phone in the trash or recycle it? Where does it go? How long does it take to degrade? What kind of gas is that giving off to warm the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So take all of these bubbles together, right? And that's your carbon footprint of your whole company. So I think a lot of people have this idea in their minds that it's maybe just their buildings or something else, but you can see that it's a whole number of things. And for service-based organizations in particular, if you don't have a big manufacturing component to what you do or retail component, you have a smaller physical footprint. But what we tend to see is that business travel piece that goes up even more because service-based organizations have to go to where their clients are, and they're doing tons of travel. And it ends up still being a really big footprint. It's just the pie is sliced up differently. This is a much bigger portion of your pie. So bear that in mind too. But all of this together becomes an important thing to wrap your mind around. And to play it out a little bit further, I want to give you a sense of, I kind of showed you the bubbles to give you just an idea of what's included, but the way that it flows together, I think is helpful to see as well. That's what this kind of diagram is attempting to do. So you've got your retail locations or your company headquarters, whatever you have. Maybe it's your house for now or wherever it is. You have some employees that are moving to and from those locations, right? You have, if you're making something, you have a manufacturing facility. You're moving goods or people to and from that manufacturing facility. And now with e-commerce, sometimes you're skipping the retail component and you're moving that good to a fulfillment center, which is then going to a customer. So there's a footprint associated with that. And then that end of life disposal piece, again, what happens to your product when your customer is done with it, there's a footprint associated with that. And then, we talked about that business travel. So your employees are flying everywhere or some places, or they're driving, doing whatever they're doing. And so all of this, you can see, just from this, why travel becomes such a big part of what we in the sustainability industry end up caring about and helping our clients figure out creative ways to drive down to the extent that it's possible, because it is typically the biggest part of any greenhouse gas footprint and typically the biggest contributor to global warming. So how does it work? How do we actually calculate it? Just a couple examples here. It's not rocket science, really. None of this is rocket science. It's just getting the data. So we need to know, in the case of flights, I pulled this as an example, the number of flights times the average miles per flight times that flight's emissions factor. And all the emissions factor does is say that per every mile you fly or per every kilometer you fly, you're going to generate X, units of GHG. So if you take an economy flight, if you're in one seat on an economy flight, and you say you take 20 flights, they're 1,000 kilometers each, and the emissions factor, these are known factors that are sort of shared around the world, that your emissions factor is that 0.14 number, you end up with a carbon footprint of about 3,000 kilograms of CO2e. And I'm not going to get into the units here because we'll be here for another hour, but just the importance of that is if you decided to fly first class instead, your seat takes up more space, and so therefore you carry more of the burden of that fuel. And those same flights over that same distance cost you about 3 times that, or 4 times the amount of the carbon footprint that you had for flying economy. And you can envision, well, what if I took a bus, or what if I rode a bike, or what if I walked? Like, all of those things go down. Now, that's not possible with flights, but just you can see the different emissions factors in your mind. And for other modes of travel, they're much, much lower. And the last thing I'll kind of say on this is just some examples of different kinds of companies' footprints and what the numbers look like. So I mentioned those scopes before, the different colors. But the way we have to track this by following international rules, we break it up into these, quote, scopes. So that's all that this is. But it all tallies up to this total GHG number that you see here. And obviously the interesting piece is if you're a manufacturer, this is quite a big manufacturer, they can have a really big footprint, right? A service firm can have a tiny footprint. And in this case, a university has a totally different footprint. Now, the one wrinkle here, and I see we have questions coming in, I'll pause in a couple minutes to take them. The one wrinkle here is that there's no rules around what you have to measure in scope 3 in those pink bubbles. So companies right now tend to measure only what's advantageous for them to measure. So what that means is the real greenhouse gas footprint of most companies is really not known because they're not measuring the entire thing. More and more are starting to. I'm seeing it as a trend where even now, like the big companies are like, okay, we can't hide behind this rule that the world isn't making us know what scope 3 is anymore. Like, we need to know what it is. And they're pretty scared of what the results are going to be, but they're starting to measure at this point. All right, let me see what the questions are. Okay, are there any tools available for startups to get quick access to ESG educational resources or requesting suppliers audit from both market power to request it and tools to get it efficiently? Do you find FedEx, Higgs indexes, et cetera, convenient for small companies, or is there something missing on the market? I'm actually not sure on the last part of the question. I don't know. I'll have to look into it and get back to. I can get back to you on that. I don't know that answer. But as far as tools go, I mean, it depends where you're at. There are lots of free tools that are available. If you want sort of and I have a list of resources. I'm going to distribute the slides to the extent that that's okay with Tracy, either through her or after this. But there's a list of some resources in there that some of which may help you in that regard. But, you know, every company is so different, and there's some knowledge required to like accurately think through these things, that there aren't really any great off-the-shelf free tools that I think are worth their weight for anything beyond like an initial scan. Like you just want to sort of understand what's even included in ESG. There's some tools for that. But if you want to go down the path at all of what do I do about it? What does my company do about it? What makes sense for me? There's no great tools for that I am aware of. Okay. Let's see. And then we have another question here. So from an investor who wants to implement a sustainability assessment layer to new and existing investments, are there widely recognized tools which investors can use to understand the sustainability focus or factors material to startups, and likewise can be used on the startup side to measure, manage, and report without taking too much manual time and resource for the startup to manage? Yes, so, there are. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to say that this is part of what we do at 500 is part of this sort of training style webinar, which is we provide is, you know, we also during the diligence process, we have an ESG questionnaire that we ask all startups to fill out. And the reason we use that is it's really specifically designed for startups. It's in the back of our ESG or our most recent ESG annual report. So you can get a sense for the type of questions asked. For us, we are looking at, you know, where are companies starting at with the assumption that they're probably quite small, anywhere between 2 and 10 employees, with some outliers potentially of more employees. But we designed the questionnaire with a number of standards in mind. I come from the impact investing space is where I spent a large part of my career. So I'm quite familiar with metrics and measurement, and designed it not to be too onerous. Now, ours is really geared towards understanding what kinds of tools and education are sort of important to startups in our program. But you could extend those and take those into sort of more specific metrics for a company that was potentially sort of even slightly sort of later stage, if you will. So anyway, I just wanted to add that as a potential resource. And then Mike, of course, anything you have to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I wish there were more widely recognized tools, but there's a reason that like beyond sort of 500's desire to lasso this themselves, that they made the questionnaire. And it's because a lot of these things are not really floating out there in the early stage space. And it's a problem. There's more of them being created, but there's nothing that's widely recognized yet. And that is really an issue. There's a gap. There's white space there to be addressed. The knowledge is there, but it tends to be hidden in pockets, and you have to kind of know where to look to unearth it. And I think that's a lot of the problem right now. So I wish I had a better answer for you, anonymous attendee, but I don't right now. Okay. All right, so I'm going to leave the carbon footprint piece there. I just put it in for a few reasons, but one, if there was sort of one thing that I wanted you to think about, like one sustainability topic, if you want to call it that, it would be the carbon footprint, because it is a credible, robust thing to address. If you're going to address nothing else and you sort of got your arms around the carbon footprint, not even necessarily knowing what exactly it is, because you're early and it's probably too soon to do a bunch of GHG inventories. It might not just make sense, but even if you just know what's in it and you can begin to point the ship in the right direction to make those bubbles smaller without necessarily knowing how to measure it, that is a solid thing to do. That's a great place to start, and eventually you'll get to a place where you want to measure it. But the sustainability word is so broad that to make it more specific, but still keep it under one umbrella, under the carbon footprint umbrella, you can deal with a lot. I mean, you can deal with a ton of things that are material to your business. The other thing that I would say, and I mentioned this before, this might seem obvious, but having a sustainability vision and goal statement, and you could pick from any number of topics. I just wrote up a few and put them up here. The list could be the menu you can order from could be very long, but I would say pick one, and you just start from there. Another way to do it would be to go back to something like the SDGs and say, which one of these is most material to my business? How can I begin to set a vision and a goal around one of these? And maybe it's climate action, right? And then some clients that I deal with, like this was Battery Park City, is a real estate entity in New York. They're a client of ours. And we end up helping them think through a whole number of topics, but one of which is their sustainability plan and their vision. And so the vision statement itself is pretty mundane. It doesn't say very much, or it's broad enough to be flexible, but I do think it is helpful. At least they note some specific points that they want to be addressing. And the goal is really more what matters. So they have a number of goals behind their sustainability plan, but it's just a matter of picking one that's time bound. So in this case, they want to reduce the energy of their buildings by 2025 by 60%. They want a board of directors that achieves gender equality by 2022. And this can be a goal. Like if you don't know enough to pick the numbers yet, the goal is give yourself a deadline by which you'll have the assessment done or have more thinking around this so that you can be more specific. I mean, this is really common amongst the clientele that I deal with, even of some very large organizations. So if you're very early, you're probably going to need to begin to think about, well, what's my time frame for knowing more about this? And that's a very reasonable thing to do. So then the third thing I mentioned before was tell your story. A client that we did in one of those audits for the sustainability audits, it came back that they were pretty bad at waste. Like they just weren't recycling, and there was not that many good reasons for it. They had a lot of potential, but they weren't doing it. And we had a lot of discussions with them around, they initially thought, well, we need to kind of keep this quiet and fix it. And we sort of said, well, you could own this, and you could talk to your kind of internal stakeholders, and you can talk to your employees and your tenants and some others, and let them know that this is an area that you need to improve and that you need their help to improve it, and here's what you're willing to do. And they got over sort of the hurdle of feeling like they were airing their dirty laundry, and they could talk at that point, they could talk about the things they were really good at, which was this commuting and travel and their energy use, and then say, but by the way, we have some room to improve this. And it made people see the positivity of the good things even more, but it really let them get people to crowdsource ideas and think about how they were going to improve this waste problem. And then when we went back to them, a couple of years later, their waste score was like through the roof. It became one of their best things. And I don't know this for sure, but I'm fairly convinced if they had not kind of put it out there front and center, that they would not have had the motivation or the impetus to get that done. And I heard from many people as a part of this, when we were dealing with this client internally, that they really appreciated the honesty, that they knew it wasn't greenwashing. That became a very big part of why people started to buy into the sustainability mission. And then I mentioned the advisor bit. This is the fourth thing. And, like I have the note at the top here, things arise in real time, right? You're dealing with changing regulations, risks, opportunities, needs for your business, supply chain changes, investor questions. Like there is no substitute to have some sort of an advisor talking to your company leadership, or you can, there's obviously formal and informal ways to do this, but the bottom line is you need to be plugging in with somebody that can be your partner to help you think and through these things real time, and particularly advise in advance on strategic decisions for the organization. Where we have companies that don't, when I work with companies that don't have that, that is usually a number one. Like you might bring me in as a consultant to help you, and you can bring me in as a long-term advisor or not. But whoever it is, like somebody needs to be filling this role for you, because until it happens, you're going to struggle with all the rest of it. And that has never changed in every organization we've dealt with. So if even before the carbon footprint, I would say find somebody informally, formally, whatever, to put in this role and begin to think through these things with you. All right, I know I threw a ton at you. The approach that I was kind of taking with this was to maybe pique your interest or flip over some stones, and hopefully there was something in here for the different folks that tuned in, and really not delve too deep into each subject, but just get you to think about what you might want to look at further. Like I've got additional resources in the deck. I said I'll share it out, but I'm happy now we can open it up for questions, comment, critique, anything. It's all fair game. So thanks for sticking with me. Okay. Oh, we have stuff in the chat now. Let's see what we got. Sorry, give me a second here. Okay, we had a couple of these already. I think the new one is maybe, how do you certificate your startups are ESG compliant if they are in late seed or Series A? I think we had this one already, didn't we? I think we had all these. Okay, so if there's nothing else, then
yeah, then I guess we can go ahead and wrap it up. If there's no more questions, going once, going twice. Thank you everyone for attending. We're going to do more of these talks, so stay tuned. We're also have done some of these talks previously, and they can be found on the 500 website under our ESG page. And as Mike mentioned, we'll be sending around materials after the talk as well. So in case there's any of you who are interested in receiving them, we'll make them available. And if you have any questions related to ESG or topics that you want us to cover, please feel free to reach out to me either directly, and I'm Tracy.Barba at 500startups.com or marketing@500startups.com. So I look forward to hearing from you, and thank you very much for your interest. And thank you, Mike, for sharing your experience and expertise with us today.